15 of Hollywood's most condemned stars were innocent, and the people who destroyed them knew it at the time. These are not tragedies. These are crimes. And tonight, we are opening the sealed files that prove it. The girl the world failed first. She was discovered, the story goes, sitting at the counter of a drugstore on Sunset Boulevard, sipping a soda and dreaming of nowhere in particular, when a talent agent looked up from his newspaper and saw the future of American cinema. It was a perfect story. Warm, accidental, faded, the kind of origin myth that made audiences feel the movies were magic, that glamour could find you anywhere if you were beautiful enough and lucky enough and pure enough at heart. It was also almost entirely a fiction. The real story of Lana Turner begins not with a soda fountain, but with a Saturday night in San Francisco in 1930 when a man named John Virgil Turner was found in an alley, the victim of a robbery gone wrong. He was 37 years old. His daughter Julia, the girl the world would one day call Lana, was 9. And from that night forward, the trajectory of her life changed in ways that no studio publicist would ever be permitted to describe. Her mother Mildred did what she could. She worked as a beautician, moving from city to city in search of steadier ground, and young Julia moved with her, or didn't, depending on the month and the money. There were stretches when Mildred simply couldn't manage, and the girl was sent to live with relatives, or with neighbors, or with families who were strangers in everything but legal arrangement. The instability was the slow, grinding kind, the kind that teaches a child that the people who love you leave, that warmth is temporary, that the only thing you can depend on is the performance of being fine. In 1937, Henry Wilson spotted a Hollywood high school student named Julia Turner, renamed her Lana, and delivered her to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, where Howard Strickling's publicity department constructed the soda fountain story, placing her origin entirely outside the realm of grief or instability. The real childhood, the father found in an alley, the years of displacement, was buried in a press kit that no journalist was ever permitted to open. On what the fan magazines offered instead was a woman who seemed to burn with an almost reckless, emotional intensity, who fell in love completely and repeatedly and disastrously, who married 8 times and meant it every single time. Audiences called it a weakness for drama. But those who understood where she had come from recognized it for what it was. A child who had learned early that love was unreliable developed as an adult an almost desperate need to secure it, to hold it so tightly that it couldn't slip away the way everything had slipped away before. In 1958, Lana Turner's 14-year-old daughter Cheryl fatally wounded her mother's abusive boyfriend Johnny Stompanato in their home. It's what the press found complicated every story they had been told about this woman. A daughter raised in a house with a mother who loved her and a series of men who didn't, replaying in one terrible moment everything that childhood instability had set in motion. The courtroom footage of Turner testifying, her composure, her devastation, her extraordinary performance of grief while actually living it, was called by some observers the finest acting of her career. She never quite recovered from the particular cruelty of that sentence. What the fixers could not bury was the physical evidence of everything the machine had built on top of that grief. Turner's face, which made her one of the most photographed women in the world, was by her own account something she could never quite believe belonged to her. She once told a journalist that when she looked in the mirror, she saw not herself, but the character the studio had constructed, the lighting, the makeup, the careful management of every angle. The real face underneath, she said, was the face of the 9-year-old girl in San Francisco who had not yet learned to perform anything. She spent the rest of her life never finding a way back to her. The distance between those two stories is the distance between the woman audiences thought they knew and the woman who actually lived that life, carrying a grief too old and too private for any publicity department to manage. Wilson renamed Lana Turner and handed her to the MGM machine. That same machine had a policy for every star who came through its gates. And for the next woman on our list, the policy was to sand away everything specific about who she actually was until only something useful remained. The name she was never allowed to keep. She is the most decorated performer in the history of American entertainment. An Oscar, an Emmy, a Grammy, Tony, the EGOT, that nearly impossible constellation of awards that fewer than 20 artists in history have ever achieved. And yet, for the better part of a decade, the studio that held her contract did everything in its institutional power to ensure the world would never know exactly who she was. Her name was Rosa Dolores Alverio. She was born in Humacao, Puerto Rico in 1931, the daughter of a seamstress named Rosa Maria. And she arrived in New York City at the age of 5 with her mother, who had come north looking for a better life. A talent agent spotted her and made the call that would change everything. Within years, she had a contract. Within years after that, she had a new name. Rita Moreno. Clean, pronounceable, ethnically ambiguous enough to be useful. What followed was one of the most sustained acts of cultural erasure in the history of the studio system. MGM's approach was not to develop her specific gifts. It was to sand her down into a usable shape. The accent coaching began immediately. The precise musical cadences of her Puerto Rican Spanish smoothed into something that wouldn't read as foreign to a 1950s American audience. The roles that followed began with an Egyptian slave in one film, a Native American maiden in the next. She has spoken publicly about sitting in the makeup chair for those roles. The specific, a grinding shame of being costumed as every culture except her own, of being told that the woman she actually was constituted a professional obstacle. Then came the Hawaiian girl, the Indian princess, whatever exotic placeholder the next script required, useful precisely because she had been stripped of the particular identity that might have made her too real, too specific, to herself. This was not one executive's careless bias. It was the MGM machine operating exactly as Howard Strickling had built it. The specific culture you came from was not an asset to be celebrated. It was a complicated task to manage. The full measure of what the system took from her did not become clear until 1961, when Rita Moreno won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for West Side Story. She was the first Latina actress ever to win the award. She walked to that stage in a room full of the same industry that had spent a decade telling her that her specific identity was a liability, and she accepted the Oscar wearing a dress she had borrowed. Not because she couldn't afford one, because the studios that had profited from her work for 10 years had not offered her a single contract worthy of buying her own. The applause in that room was genuine. The irony was complete. The woman they had spent a decade erasing had just become the first of her kind to stand at the top of the industry that had tried to make her disappear. The MGM machine erased who Rita Moreno was before she could become who she was meant to be. And what comes next is the story of what that same machine did when it needed to erase not an identity, but a tragedy, and it had less than an hour to do it. The death scene, Eddie Mannix, reached first. On the morning of September 5, 1932, the most electric woman in Hollywood was about to lose control of her own story, and she would never fully get it back. Jean Harlow was 21 years old and at the absolute peak of her power, the platinum blonde, MGM's most valuable female star. She had married MGM executive Paul Byrne earlier that year, a match the studio encouraged and the fan magazine celebrated with enthusiasm they reserved for unions that served everyone's interests. Then came the morning of September 5th. Paul Byrne was found in their Benedict Canyon home, having suffered a fatal wound. Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling arrived before the Los Angeles Police Department, before the investigators, before anyone with a legal obligation to document what they found. The two most powerful fixers in Hollywood were alone in that house, with the body, before the official record began. By the time investigators arrived, the machinery was running. Strickling managed press access with a completeness those who covered Hollywood described as remarkable, even by the standards of the day. A note was found at the scene, its authenticity disputed by biographers for 9 decades, and it became the explanation that officially closed the case. The official ruling was that Paul Byrne had taken his own life. The press reported what Strickling gave them to report. Jean Harlow was not permitted to grieve without the machine's supervision. A young woman present on set, hitting her marks, delivering her lines, carrying something beneath the surface the cameras were never quite pointed at directly. When she reported to the set of Saratoga in the spring of 1937, co-star Clark Gable later said she looked like she was already somewhere else. Her skin had taken on a yellowish tint. She was exhausted in a way that sleep was no longer touching. The studio kept shooting. On May 29, 1937, Harlow collapsed on set. She was taken home rather than to a hospital, a decision shaped by her mother, Mama Jean's Christian Science convictions, which discouraged conventional medical intervention. The studio, which had been watching her deteriorate for weeks, did not override this. The asset was failing. The machine's response was to protect the production schedule, not the person. She passed away 9 days later. Saratoga had 11 days of shooting remaining. The studio used a stand-in. The film came out on schedule. Saratoga became one of the highest-grossing pictures of that year. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer earned more from Jean Harlow in the summer of her passing than in any previous summer of her career. She passed away in June of 1937 at 26 years old. The cause was kidney failure, treatable if caught in time. From the morning of September 5, 1932, she had never controlled a single version of her own story. Mannix and Strickling managed Jean Harlow's tragedy with complete efficiency. But some of what the fixers protected was not a cover-up at all. Some of it was simply a private arrangement between 3 people who had decided that grace was worth more than acknowledgement. The next man on our list was one of Hollywood's most respected actors, and Howard Strickling spent 30 years quietly removing him from bars and keeping it out of every paper in the country. The triangle nobody named Spencer Tracy won 2 consecutive Academy Awards for Best Actor, for Captains Courageous in 1937 and Boys Town in 1938. And the industry's respect went beyond the professional, into something closer to reverence. Directors said the camera simply believed him. There was no visible mechanism to his acting. He appeared on screen to simply be. He was married to Louise Treadwell. They had 2 children, a daughter named Susie and a son named John, who was born with hearing difficulties that would shape the entire subsequent trajectory of his parents' lives. Tracy, a man of deep Catholic faith, interpreted his son's condition as judgment, punishment for his own moral failures. The guilt lodged in him and never left, expressing itself in a dependency on alcohol and a distance from Louise that no amount of public appearances could close. Howard Strickling reportedly assigned a dedicated team, a driver, a doctor, and attendants whose real function was protective, to manage Tracy's condition quietly. This arrangement, which those close to the studio referred to as the Tracy Squad, ran for years without a single incident reaching the press. By the late 1930s, the marriage existed in name only, maintained because Tracy's Catholicism made ending it genuinely unthinkable. And then, in 1941, he met Katharine Hepburn. What followed was 26 years of a relationship maintained in almost total public silence. Hepburn accepted an arrangement that gave her everything except acknowledgement. She existed in the public record of his life as a colleague and a friend. Louise Tracy conducted herself with a dignity so absolute, it constitutes one of the most remarkable performances in Hollywood history. And she was not, by profession, a performer. She maintained the formal marriage, raised their children, and in 1942 channeled the grief of her private situation into founding the John Tracy Clinic, dedicated to teaching children with hearing difficulties to speak. Then there is this detail, the one that stops you. Katharine Hepburn made anonymous donations to the John Tracy Clinic. The woman who loved Spencer Tracy in private gave money, without her name attached, to the institution built by the wife of the man they both loved. That single act, quiet, uncredited, extraordinary, tells you more about the character of everyone in this triangle than any biography has ever captured. Tracy passed away in June of 1967. Hepburn was with him. She did not attend his funeral out of respect for Louise. Three people handled an impossible arrangement with more grace than the system that produced it deserved. After Spencer Tracy passed away, Katharine Hepburn kept a photograph of Louise Tracy on her desk for the rest of her life. Not a photograph of Spencer, of Louise. Those who knew her well suggested she understood something the public narrative had never fully captured, that Louise Tracy was not the woman who had been wronged by the story. She was the woman who had made the story survivable for everyone inside it. Hepburn lived to 96. She kept that photograph for nearly 4 decades. Some debts, it seems, are acknowledged in the only currency available when all other options are closed. Strickling kept Spencer Tracy's private life invisible for 3 decades. The next secret required something more elaborate, an entire false biography built on a birthplace chosen because its records had burned. The heritage she was forbidden to claim. Of all the secrets on this list, this one required the longest daily performance. Not on a soundstage, but in every conversation, every photograph, every room she ever walked into for the rest of her life. When Merle Oberon appeared in Wuthering Heights in 1939, opposite Laurence Olivier, in a performance that earned her an Academy Award nomination, audiences saw exactly what the studio intended: an elegant, aristocratic beauty of impeccable British origin, born in Tasmania. That birthplace had been selected specifically because its public records had been largely lost to fire, making verification essentially impossible. The truth: Merle Oberon was born Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson in Bombay, India, in 1911. Her mother, Constance, was a young woman of mixed heritage, part Sinhalese, part Maori, part British. The circumstances of Merle's birth were concealed not only from the public, but from Merle herself for years. She was raised believing her grandmother Charlotte was her mother, and that Constance was her older sister. The studio expanded the existing family fiction into a complete, alternate biography. The Tasmanian origin, the aristocratic background, the British gentility, each element was chosen to place her as far as possible from the mixed heritage girl born in colonial Bombay who would have found no place in Hollywood's strictly policed racial hierarchy. Maintenance of this fiction required vigilance that never relaxed. Studio-mandated skin treatments, specialized photographic lighting. Her husbands were not told the truth. Her children were not told the truth. The performance of a constructed identity was not something she could set down at the end of a workday. It was the condition under which she existed in the world, every day and for the rest of her life. Constance, her actual mother, performing the role of older sister, traveled to a film set once to watch her daughter work. Studio staff were instructed to ensure they were not seen together. There is a particular detail about that visit that those who documented it found almost unbearable to write. Constance positioned herself where she could see without being seen, because the instruction to stay apart was absolute, and she had learned not to test it. She watched her daughter work for perhaps an hour. She watched the lighting crew adjust for the complexion that the studio had spent years managing. She watched the directors and other actors treat the woman she had given birth to with the deference reserved for the very famous. And then she left, without being spoken to, without being introduced, without being able to claim, to a single person present, the most basic truth available to her. She was her mother. She had been there. Nobody knew. Merle Oberon carried that weight to her grave. Behind the composed, luminous face audiences adored was a woman who could never, not once in her public life, tell the simplest truth about herself, that she had a mother and that she loved her. In the final years of her life, Oberon began a memoir she never completed, intending, for the first time, to tell the truth about her origins. She passed away in 1979 before the project was finished. The truth she had carried for half a century passed away in the attempt to speak it, not quite reaching the page. Constance had passed away years earlier. The woman who might have read those pages and finally been named, finally been claimed, never got to. Oberon could not claim her mother. The next woman on our list claimed her daughter, but only after hiding her, placing her in an orphanage, and adopting her own child under a fiction that Howard Strickling designed and managed from beginning to end. The daughter Clark Gable never spoke of, In the winter of 1935, two of Hollywood's most luminous stars traveled to British Columbia to film The Call of the Wild. Clark Gable was 34 years old and at the apex of his magnetism. Loretta Young was 22, possessed of a beauty and a Catholic devotion that together constituted her entire public identity. What it cost the child born from what happened between them took 60 years to fully understand. Loretta Young found herself expecting a child. The timing was catastrophic. She was, in the public imagination, a paragon of Catholic virtue whose image studio publicity had spent years cultivating. Howard Strickling went to work. What followed was one of the most thoroughly documented fixer operations in Hollywood history. Strickling flooded the press with stories of Young's mysterious illness. He arranged an in-home interview with Young connected to a dummy intravenous line. Young gave birth privately, and the infant was placed in an orphanage. Then Strickling made the announcement. Loretta Young would be adopting 2 children, not 1, because a single girl appearing from nowhere might generate questions. The second child, it was later announced, had been reclaimed by her biological mother. Young was left heartbroken with only Judy. So Judy Lewis grew up with a secret at the center of everything, like a stone in a stream, shaping the current without ever being named. Strickling had ensured she was never photographed without a hat, managing even the photographic record of her childhood. She confronted Loretta Young in 1966. Young confirmed it. Gable had been gone for 6 years, having never acknowledged the daughter he helped bring into the world. Young carried the guilt for the rest of her life. Their daughter carried the confusion of it for all of hers. Strickling had been retired for 3 years by the time the truth came out. He had buried this particular secret for 31 years. The child is always the last to know, and the child always pays the longest. Judy Lewis spent years after the confirmation quietly trying to understand the woman her mother had actually been. What she found, she later wrote, was not a villain. She found a 22-year-old girl who had been handed an impossible situation by powerful men and had done the only thing the system made available to her. Young's Catholic faith, the same faith that had made an honest solution impossible, eventually became the framework through which she processed the guilt. She reportedly went to confession about what had happened for the rest of her life. Absolution, it seems, was one thing that Howard Strickling could not arrange. The next secret required a different kind of fixer, one who operated not through press management, but through coercion, underworld connections, and a marriage arranged in a matter of weeks. The marriage that was a business agreement. By the mid-1950s, Rock Hudson was the most bankable leading man in Hollywood. The jaw, the shoulders, the easy, unhurried charm. Fan magazines devoted entire issues to his bachelor status, printing photographs suggesting a man contentedly waiting for the right person to come along. The image functioned as cultural wallpaper, always there, never questioned. Impossible to see clearly precisely because it was everywhere. In 1955, Confidential magazine had a $10,000 bounty on a Rock Hudson expose, and the wallpaper was about to come down. Henry Wilson, the agent who had built Hudson's career from a truck driver from Winnetka named Roy Scherer into Hollywood's most bankable leading man, understood exactly what the Confidential story would do. That he went to the magazine's editors and made a trade. In exchange for suppressing the Hudson story, Wilson gave them documented information about Rory Calhoun's criminal record and details about Tab Hunter's arrest at a private party in 1950. Both men were his own clients. He traded their secrets to protect one man while sacrificing 2 others, then arranged for Hudson to marry Phyllis Gates, his own secretary, within weeks. Wilson also employed off-duty Los Angeles Police Department officers to intimidate anyone who might otherwise come forward. What almost no one outside a small Hollywood circle knew was the full cost Wilson extracted from Hudson in exchange for that protection. Hudson had been under Wilson's management since he was a naive 20-year-old with a screen test and no name. Former associates later described the relationship as one of the most controlling in Hollywood history, an arrangement in which the agent knew enough to professionally undermine his most valuable client and made certain Hudson understood that at all times. The marriage to Phyllis Gates was not merely a publicity solution, it was the final demonstration of who held the power in that room. The wedding was announced, the fan magazine celebrated, the wallpaper was repaired. The marriage lasted 3 years, served its purpose, and Hudson returned to his private life, while the public performance continued for 3 more decades. In July of 1985, Rock Hudson appeared at a press conference alongside Doris Day and looked shockingly unwell. Within weeks, the announcement came. He had received a grave medical diagnosis, choosing to say so publicly at a moment when the epidemic was being treated as a problem belonging to people it was acceptable to ignore. He was the first major celebrity to put a human face on the crisis. Donations to research organizations increased dramatically. He left $250,000 to help establish what became the American Foundation for AIDS Research. He passed away in October of that year. The man who had spent his entire career hiding who he was used the last months of his life to force the world to see what it had been refusing to look at. That is not a scandal. That is courage. What the public could not have known was the full private cost of what those final months had required of him. and he had spent 30 years carefully maintaining a performance so complete that most of his closest professional colleagues later said they had genuinely not known the truth. Doris Day, who had co-starred with him in 3 enormously popular films and remained one of his dearest friends, said she had no idea until the announcement. The particular loneliness of that, of being genuinely loved by people who loved a version of you that was not entirely real, is something Hudson carried without complaint for 3 decades. His final act of honesty was not only courageous. For a man who had spent his life performing, it was also, perhaps for the first time, a genuine rest. In the weeks after Hudson's announcement, President Ronald Reagan, who had known him personally for decades, was asked by reporters about the public health crisis that his friend's announcement had suddenly made impossible to ignore. Reagan had not yet publicly addressed the epidemic as president, despite it claiming the lives of more than 12,000 Americans by that point. He issued a brief statement of sympathy for Hudson personally. He did not change his administration's policy on research funding. Hudson had spent his final months trying to force the world to see what it had been refusing to look at. The world, it turned out, still had some refusing left to do. Wilson protected Rock Hudson by sacrificing 2 other men's secrets. The next woman on our list had no fixer protecting her, only her own silence. He maintained for 30 years while the man she protected received every benefit of her discretion. The confession Gary Cooper never made. Gary Cooper in 1949 was the embodiment of a particular American ideal. Tall, laconic, morally unambiguous. He had won an Academy Award for Sergeant York and would win another for High Noon. His public image was so thoroughly identified with integrity that critics sometimes complained they couldn't see the acting for virtue. Patricia Neal was 23 years old when she met him on the set of The Fountainhead. Luminous, gifted, and completely unprepared for the force of what happened to her. He was 48, married to socialite Veronica Balfi, known as Rocky. The affair continued for nearly 3 years. In 1950, Patricia Neal found herself expecting a child. A clandestine medical procedure was arranged, dangerous, carried out under conditions bearing no resemblance to legitimate medical care. Neal underwent it in the solitude that women in her position were required to endure. In the days that followed, she returned to work. There were costumes to put on and marks to hit, and directors calling action as if the world were the same size it had been before. She composed her face each morning before the camera found it, arranging the warmth and professionalism her career required, while carrying privately what no one in that building was permitted to acknowledge. It was, she would say decades later, the loneliest period of her life. Cooper returned to his marriage and underwent a religious recommitment to Catholicism. Rocky Cooper confronted Neal and made clear that her career would suffer if the relationship continued. Neal left Hollywood for Broadway, not because she wanted to, but because remaining had become untenable. Gary Cooper passed away in May of 1961, having never spoken publicly about any of it. Neal began speaking in the 1980s, carefully, without the bitterness that would have been entirely understandable. She believed complications from the procedure may have affected her ability to carry subsequent pregnancies. She had loved him completely. She simply stopped protecting him at the expense of her own truth. What happened to Patricia Neal in the years after she left Hollywood is one of the most extraordinary stories of personal resilience in the history of American public life. And it belongs in this chapter because it is the counter-argument to everything Gary Cooper's silence represented. In 1965, Neal suffered 3 catastrophic strokes in rapid succession while expecting her 5th child. She was 39 years old. Her husband, Roald Dahl, was told she would likely not survive, and that if she did, she would probably never work again. She not only survived, she returned to acting, was nominated for another Academy Award for The Subject Was Roses in 1968, and spent decades afterward as an advocate for stroke recovery and rehabilitation. The woman Gary Cooper had asked to carry his secret in silence went on to demonstrate exactly what kind of person he had been asking to stay quiet. She was, it turned out, considerably more than he had accounted for. Patricia Neal had no fixer working on her behalf. What comes next is the story of what happens when a fixer does his job so completely that a possible act of violence disappears from the public record entirely, and a newborn son grows up with a manufactured story instead of a father. This is the secret that nearly brought Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to its knees. The night Eddie Mannix got the call. On December 17, 1937, a comedian named Ted Healey became a father for the first time. 4 nights later, Ted Healey would be gone. And the story of how that happened would be managed so completely by the men at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer that it has never been officially resolved in the 87 years since. You may not know Ted Healey's name, but you know his legacy. He was the man who invented the Three Stooges, who discovered Moe Howard, Larry Fine, and his cousin Shemp, built an act around their physical comedy, and watched as the act he created became one of the most beloved comedy franchises in American history. By December of 1937, he was 41 years old, under contract to MGM, celebrating the birth of the son he had waited his whole life for. On the night of December 21st, 4 days after his son's birth, Healey went out to mark the occasion along the Sunset Strip, ending at the Café Trocadero. What happened there is, according to E.J. B. Fleming's extensively documented account in The Fixers, the secret that Eddie Mannix received a phone call about before the night was over. Fleming's account describes a violent confrontation outside the Trocadero involving Healey and 3 men, Wallace Beery MGM's highest-paid contract player, guaranteed by his own contract $1 more per week than any other star on the lot. Pat DeSico, a figure with underworld connections, and Albert Broccoli, who would later become famous as the producer of the James Bond films. The confrontation left Healey critically injured. He passed away the following morning from what the official record would describe as acute kidney inflammation resulting from excessive alcohol consumption. He was 41 years old. His son was 4 days old. According to Fleming's account, the Mannix received Beery's call that night, and the machinery went to work. Trocadero's staff, many already on Strickling's payroll as informants, recalled nothing specific about Beery's involvement. A story circulated about 3 unidentified college students. The coroner's finding of natural causes was, according to Fleming, arranged. Beery and his family departed for Europe immediately. Immigration records confirm a 4-month absence ending April 17, 1938. MGM organized the Ted Healey benefit show in January, raising $12,000 for Betty Healey and her newborn son, the studio that may have protected the man responsible for that child's fatherless life, presenting itself as the grieving patron of his widow. And the most telling detail in Fleming's account is not the cover-up itself, but a single reported exchange. When Howard Strickling was asked about the Healey incident years later, he paused and said, "I thought we covered that one up." Not denial, not outrage, a quiet expression of professional disappointment that the work had not held. It is the remark of a man who considered the concealment of a possible violent act a routine operational matter, the same category as managing an incident involving a vehicle or arranging a discrete medical procedure for an inconvenient situation. That is what the MGM fixer operation actually was. Not dramatic emergencies. A system. Standard procedures applied to whatever the night produced. There is a detail about Ted Healey's son the official narrative never mentioned. His name was John Jacob Healey. He grew up knowing almost nothing about the circumstances of his father's passing. The official story, the health complications, the natural causes was what he was given, and it was all he had. He was 4 days old when his father went away. He never knew him. He spent his adult years with a quiet and persistent sense that the story he had been given did not entirely account for itself. Mo Howard, who had been Ted Healey's closest friend since childhood, who was on vacation when Healey passed away and received the news by telephone from a reporter, never fully accepted the official explanation of natural causes. He told people who knew him well that he had spoken to Healey not long before that December night, that Healey had sounded fine. It sounded that the deterioration the official story required had not been present in the man Mo had known for 30 years. He did not make these doubts public. In the Hollywood of 1938, with Mannix and Strickling still fully operational, making those doubts public was not something a working comedian under studio contract could easily afford to do. So Mo Howard carried what he suspected for the rest of his life, in the same quiet way that everyone in this video learned to carry the things the machine decided they were not permitted to say out loud. Now consider what was at stake. Wallace Beery was MGM's single most expensive contractual obligation. His exposure in a possible criminal matter would have meant the immediate destruction of that asset and potential legal liability for the cover-up Mannix had run. Louis B., her mayor, had spent 20 years telling America that MGM was in the business of wholesome dreams. One honest police report would have ended that story permanently. Whether you accept Fleming's account or the official version of natural causes, the documented facts are these. A man who worked for MGM made a phone call to Eddie Mannix on the night a comedian passed away. A 4-month European trip followed immediately. Trocadero's staff, with financial connections to Strickling, recalled nothing useful, and a newborn son grew up without a father, holding a story constructed by the same men who had constructed every other story in this video. That is what almost destroyed MGM, the possible truth of what happened on a December night in 1937, and the machinery deployed to ensure it stayed buried. If these stories matter to you, subscribe now and bring someone with you. Every week we go further into the history the fan magazines were paid to ignore. Eddie Mannix's phone rang on a December night and the machinery ran without a visible seam. But not every secret in Hollywood required a named fixer. Some were buried by an industry that needed no individual operator, because the entire structure was designed to make certain people invisible from the beginning. The barrier she broke alone. On the evening of March 25, 1954, Dorothy Dandridge sat in the RKO Pantages Theater in a strapless gold gown and waited to hear whether her name would be called. She had been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress for Carmen Jones, a nomination never before given to a black woman in the award's 26-year history. She did not win. The award went to Grace Kelly for The Country Girl. What happened in the years that followed constitutes one of the most painful chapters in Hollywood history, not because it was exceptional, but because it was so entirely, systematically ordinary. The roles that should have followed a Best Actress nomination did not come. The industry continued to operate according to the same calculus it had always applied. A black woman, however gifted, could not be cast as a romantic lead opposite a white actor, could not anchor a studio picture, could not be marketed as a star in the way her talent plainly warranted. The breakthrough had changed the award's history. It had not changed the system. Behind the public face, Dandridge maintained with extraordinary discipline lay a private life she carried entirely alone. Her daughter Harolyn had been born with severe brain damage, requiring constant professional care that consumed a significant portion of everything she earned. She kept this entirely private, fearing it would be used against her. The managers entrusted with her finances directed her earnings into investments that failed, leaving her financially ruined. The hotels that hosted her film premieres sometimes refused to allow her to eat in their restaurants. The venues she performed across the American South required her to enter through service entrances. At the time of her passing, she had $2.14 in her bank account. She left a handwritten note asking that she be cremated immediately, that whatever money or furniture remained go to her mother Ruby, and sign it simply, "She will know what to do." It is the note of a woman who had been organizing the practical details of other people's lives for so long that she continued doing it from the edge of her own. She had broken a barrier that the entire industry then spent a decade ensuring she could not walk through. $2.14. Dorothy Dandridge was 42 years old when she passed away. Halle Berry was 41 when she became the second black woman ever nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, 47 years after Dandridge's nomination. When Berry won in 2002, she stood at the podium and said, "This moment is for Dorothy Dandridge, for every nameless, faceless woman of color who now has a chance because this door has been opened." 47 years. One door. Dandridge never saw it open, but she was the reason it eventually did. And that is a form of legacy that no bankruptcy, no exploitation, no $2.14 can diminish or undo. Her potential was not exhausted. It was prevented. She was a mother protecting a child while fighting every battle simultaneously, quietly, without ever asking to be acknowledged for the particular heroism of that. We want to hear from you. Which of these stories has stopped you cold? Leave a comment below and tell us which Golden Age Hollywood topic you would like us to cover next. Your suggestions shape everything we make. Dorothy Dandridge was failed by a system that needed no individual fixer because the system itself was the suppression. The next woman on our list failed differently. The studio saw exactly what she could do, and decided it didn't fit the image they were selling and buried it. The revolutionary they called just an actress. In the promotional materials Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer produced for Hedy Lamarr throughout the 1940s, the description was always some variation of the same thing: the most beautiful woman in the world. It was meant as a compliment. It functioned, in practice, as a cage. She was born Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler in Vienna in 1914. Her first marriage, to Friedrich Mondl, an Austrian arms manufacturer, had been, by her own account, a form of imprisonment. She attended his dinner parties and absorbed the conversations of weapons manufacturers and military officials. And then, in 1937, she slipped away from that life, making her way to London, then America, then MGM. Louis B. Myers signed her immediately, entirely in terms of her face. What he could not understand was that the woman they had signed as a decorative asset had arrived with a mind quietly working on a problem that would turn out to matter enormously. During the Second World War, while performing her MGM obligations by day, Lamarr spent her evenings on a problem in military communications. Guided torpedoes could be disrupted by opposing forces, their signals intercepted. She conceived of a solution, a frequency-hopping spread spectrum system in which the signal would shift unpredictably between frequencies, making interception essentially impossible. She developed this with composer George Antheil, whose experience with player piano mechanisms gave him a framework for the synchronized frequency switching the system required. Here in August of 1942, they received United States Patent Number 2,465,590 for their secret communication system. The Navy dismissed it as impractical. The patent expired in 1959. The spread spectrum principle they developed became the foundational technology underlying Wi-Fi communications, Bluetooth connectivity, and GPS systems, industries generating hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Hedy Lamarr received no compensation, almost no acknowledgement. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation awarded her its Pioneer Award. When the foundation called to tell her she was receiving the honor, she listened to the description of what her patent had eventually made possible and said simply, "It's about time." She was 82 years old. She had watched the world build a digital civilization on the foundation of her idea without sending her so much as a letter of acknowledgement for 55 years. It's about time. 4 words that contained, with extraordinary compression, everything this story is about. She passed away in January of the year 2000. The most beautiful woman in the world, MGM had called her, as if that were the largest thing she was. It was, in fact, the smallest. The final 2 secrets on this list were not buried by a fixer with a phone and a contact in the coroner's office. They were buried by something quieter and harder to prosecute. The daily agreement between an institution and a human being to pretend that everything was fine. The boy who needed a father. Begin with the child. That is where this story actually lives. Ned Wynn grew up in a Hollywood household that contained, by most external measures, everything a child could want: comfort, warmth, a mother who loved him, and a man he called his stepfather, who was genuinely affectionate and reliably present. But the child had a sense, from early on, that the household had been assembled rather than arrived at, that certain questions produced deflections rather than answers. Van Johnson, the MGM star with the red socks and the boy next door smile, was, in the texture of daily life, a father figure in every practical sense. And yet the feeling persisted, patient and unresolved, waiting for the years that would eventually explain it. His biological father was Keenan Wynn, a gifted character actor and one of Van Johnson's closest friends. His mother was Evie Wynn, who had been married to Keenan when Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer became concerned about the nature of Van Johnson's relationship with her husband. The studio's anxiety about that friendship produced a solution that the studio's logic found elegant, and the human beings involved found considerably more complicated. MGM brought pressure to bear on Evie to end her marriage to Keenan and marry Van Johnson instead. Through contract clauses, career implications, and the understood knowledge of what happened to stars whose private lives became inconvenient, Evie agreed. Keenan Wynn moved out of the daily life of a child who had not been consulted about any of it. What the studio's arrangement could not account for was what happened to Keenan Wynn himself in the years that followed. He had lost his marriage, his home, and the daily presence of his son, all to protect an institutional investment he had no contractual stake in. Those who knew him in that period described a man who had been asked to absorb a loss that had no professional category, only a human one. He continued working, a reliable, prolific character actor who appeared in dozens of films across 4 decades. And by most accounts, he and Van Johnson maintained the friendship that had set the entire arrangement in motion. The 3 adults in this story managed the impossible with more decency than the institution that created it had any right to expect. But Keenan Wynn did not get to watch his son grow up inside his own home. That is the cost the studio did not put in any contract. Ned Wynn eventually wrote about this in a memoir. Those who have read it describe as one of the most honestly rendered accounts of a Hollywood childhood ever committed to paper, not with anger, but with the bewildered love of someone trying to be fair to people placed in an impossible situation. The studio had engineered a family. Van Johnson and Evie made it as warm and as human as 2 people could make something assembled for institutional rather than personal reasons. Ned grew up in the seam between those 2 facts. What stayed with him longest, he wrote, was not the revelation itself, which came in adulthood, when the architecture of the household finally made sense, but the feeling he had carried as a child without being able to name it. The sense that the warmth around him was real, but the arrangement producing it was not. That the people who loved him had been placed in their positions by something outside all of them. He did not blame Van Johnson, who was by every account a genuinely kind man doing his best inside an impossible construction. He did not blame his mother, who had been given no real choice at all. He held the bewilderment gently, the way you hold something fragile that you are not sure how to put down. That is what the studio system actually cost. Not always the stars themselves, but the children who grew up inside the stories those stars were required to perform. The children who felt the weight of the fiction without knowing its name, who sensed, from the time they were old enough to sense anything, that the house they lived in had been built by strangers for reasons that had nothing to do with them. And the studio built Van Johnson a family to protect its investment. Our final story is about a man the entire country believed they knew, who came into this audience's living rooms every week for years, and the 30 years of silence his wife maintained so that image could survive. The father who couldn't go on. Think of the living room. Think of it specifically. The particular quality of a weekday evening in an American home in the 1950s. The blue-gray light of the television set, the smell of supper finishing in the kitchen, the children settling onto the floor, and on the screen, Jim Anderson, warm, patient, wise, coming home from work, listening to his children's problems, delivering the measured guidance that the situation required. Robert Young, father knows best. 183 episodes between 1954 and 1960. And in all 183 of those episodes, not a single viewer knew. He had struggled with a dependency on alcohol for years before the show began and continued throughout the run and long after it ended. Not the manageable social drinking that Hollywood's culture normalized, but a genuine, progressive condition requiring multiple hospitalizations across several decades. His wife Betty, whom he had married in 1933, managed this privately with a consistency and competence that Young himself, in his later candid moments, described as the primary reason he survived as long as he did. The network understood its investment. The image of Jim Anderson, steady, be constitutionally incapable of the kind of private chaos that Young's actual life contained, was worth protecting with the same institutional machinery that had protected every other Golden Age fiction on this list. Stories were redirected. The man who played America's most reliable father was kept in the public record as reliable as his character. The particular cruelty of Young's situation was the subject matter he was required to perform. Father Knows Best was not merely a popular program. It was a weekly instruction manual for what a family was supposed to look like, what a father was supposed to sound like, what safety and wisdom looked like wearing a cardigan and carrying a briefcase. Robert Young performed that instruction manual 183 times, while privately unable to perform it once. The gap between what the camera saw and what Betty saw when the camera stopped is not merely ironic. It is the most complete illustration in this entire video of what the Golden Age's demand for performed perfection actually cost. Paid weekly, in the privacy of a home that looked exactly like the one on the screen. In 1991, Robert Young made an attempt on his own life. Betty found him. She had spent nearly 6 decades being the person who found him, managing the hospitalizations and the relapses and the particular loneliness of living beside someone whose inner suffering was invisible to the world that celebrated him. She did this without acknowledgement, in the manner of a woman who had decided, at some early point, that this was simply what love required. For Young eventually went public, speaking candidly about his dependency on alcohol and his struggles with low mood and despair, becoming a mental health advocate. He lived to 91. The later honesty was real and valuable, but could not fully repay the decades of performed wellness maintained at Betty's expense. He received the credit for the courage it took to finally speak. She received almost none for the courage it took to remain silent for 30 years, when silence was the only protection available. Betty Young lived to 90 years old. She and Robert were married for 61 years before his passing in 1998. In the years after he went public, Young received letters from across the country, from people who said his honesty had given them permission to seek help, to speak to their families, to stay alive, and he answered many of them personally. Betty helped him answer the rest. The man America had watched pretend to be well for 30 years spent his final decade genuinely helping people who were not. That redemption was real. But it began, as every chapter in this video has begun, with a woman deciding quietly that her job was to hold the architecture together until the person inside it was ready to walk out on his own. She is the last figure in this story. She is also the most important one. Mannix and Strickling, Henry Wilson, Louis B. Mayer, the network executives at NBC. The unnamed casting directors never called Dorothy Dandridge back. They all ran versions of the same machine. They all made the same calculation, that the image was worth more than the person inside it. And they were all, eventually, wrong, because time turned out to be a more thorough investigator than any of them. These 13 secrets survived, and in surviving, they have given us something more valuable than the polished images we were originally offered. They have given us the real people, which, as it turns out, is so much more worth loving. If these stories have moved you, please like this video and share it with someone in your life who loves classic Hollywood. Every share helps more people find the history the fan magazines were paid to leave out. And if you have not yet subscribed to Golden Age Files, this is the moment. We are here every week with more of the stories the studio system spent fortunes to bury. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, celebrating the full, complicated, luminous humanity of the stars who built Hollywood's golden dreams. Thank you for watching.